By the middle of World War II, the most advanced air force in Europe was flying on fuel that had been extracted from rocks buried underground. And the tank crews pushing across the Eastern Front were burning gasoline that had never come anywhere near an oil well. The German war machine, famous for its Panzers and Messerschmitts and the terrifying speed of Blitzkrieg, was running on something that sounds almost impossible when you first hear it. Coal. Not petroleum pumped from the earth in liquid form, but solid black coal that German chemists had learned to transform into the fuel that modern warfare demanded. This wasn't a backup plan or an emergency measure that came late in the conflict, and it wasn't some minor supplement to traditional oil supplies. By 1943, more than half of all the fuel powering Germany's military came from coal converted through industrial chemistry into synthetic gasoline and diesel. That fact alone tells you everything about how desperate Germany's situation really was, and why the war's outcome was probably sealed long before the final battles were fought. The fundamental problem was simple, and it was baked into Germany's geography from the very beginning. In 1938, a full year before the invasion of Poland started the war, Germany consumed approximately 44 million barrels of oil. That number sounds substantial until you realize where it came from. Roughly 60% of that oil, about 28 million barrels, had to be imported from overseas sources. Another 3.8 million barrels arrived overland from European suppliers, primarily Romania. Domestic oil production within Germany's borders contributed a pathetic 3.8 million barrels to the national supply, nowhere close to what an industrial economy required, let alone what a military preparing for continental war would need. The comparison with other major powers made the situation even more alarming. Great Britain consumed 76 million barrels that same year, nearly double Germany's usage. The Soviet Union burned through 183 million barrels. The United States, even before entering the war, was consuming approximately 1 billion barrels annually, a figure so enormous that it existed in a completely different category. While American oil companies struggled to find enough storage tanks for their surplus, German planners were counting every barrel and wondering how long their reserves would last once serious fighting began. Germany had almost no natural petroleum deposits worth mentioning. The oil that existed was scattered in small pockets that couldn't be expanded, no matter how much money or manpower was thrown at them. The nation that intended to conquer Europe was starting the race with an almost empty fuel tank. If you're finding this breakdown useful, take a second to subscribe, because what Germany did next was nothing short of revolutionary. What Germany lacked in oil, it possessed in coal, and the abundance was almost overwhelming. Coal provided 90% of Germany's total energy consumption, powering factories, heating homes, driving locomotives, and forming the backbone of one of the world's most advanced industrial economies. Between 1938 and 1939, German mines extracted 187.5 million tons of coal, a figure that continued climbing throughout the war until reaching a peak of 268.7 million tons in 1944. German mining operations were among the most mechanized in Europe, with productivity figures that left competitors far behind. Output per man-hour exceeded Great Britain's by approximately 1/3 and doubled what France and Belgium could achieve. Territorial acquisitions during the early stages of the war added even more coal to German control. Czechoslovakia and Poland both contained substantial coal deposits that fell under Reich administration, expanding the resource base that German industry could draw upon. Unlike oil, which had to be imported across oceans or pipelines that enemies could interdict, coal sat right beneath German soil, accessible and abundant, and apparently inexhaustible. The question that German scientists had been asking since the 1920s was whether this coal could somehow become the liquid fuel that modern machines required. The answer, it turned out, was yes, and the chemistry behind it would shape the entire trajectory of the war. Both coal and petroleum share a fundamental characteristic that made conversion theoretically possible. They're both composed of hydrocarbons, complex molecules built from hydrogen, and carbon atoms, arranged in various configurations. Petroleum is essentially ancient, organic matter that geological processes transformed into liquid form over millions of years. Coal is ancient organic matter that the same processes transformed into solid form. The basic building blocks are similar, and what nature accomplished over geological timescales, German chemists believed they could replicate in industrial facilities. Coal was first gasified by heating it in a controlled environment, breaking down the solid material into a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen known as synthesis gas. This gas was then fed through reactors containing specific catalysts, where chemical reactions reassembled the molecules into liquid hydrocarbons that could be refined into diesel fuel and, with additional processing, gasoline. The second approach was the Bergius hydrogenation process, which took a more direct route. High pressure and elevated temperatures, combined with hydrogen gas and catalysts, could convert coal directly into liquid fuel without the intermediate gasification step. This method was particularly effective for producing high-quality gasoline suitable for aircraft engines, though it required even more industrial infrastructure. The processes worked and produced fuel that actually powered vehicles and aircraft. The catch was that they required enormous facilities, vast quantities of coal, significant amounts of electricity, and years of construction before a single drop of synthetic fuel emerged. Germany's interest in synthetic fuel didn't begin with World War II or even with Hitler's rise to power. The roots stretched back to World War I, when the British naval blockade had exposed just how vulnerable Germany was to supply disruption. Cut off from overseas imports, the German economy had slowly strangled, contributing directly to eventual defeat and the collapse that followed. Military planners and industrial leaders who survived that experience vowed never to let it happen again. The economic chaos of the 1920s added another layer of motivation. Germany lacked the foreign exchange currency needed to purchase oil from abroad in sufficient quantities. Every barrel of imported petroleum drained hard currency that the struggling economy desperately needed for other purposes. Synthetic fuel produced from domestic coal would keep that money inside Germany's borders, reducing dependence on international markets that could turn hostile at any moment. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the ideological dimension intensified everything. Nazi doctrine emphasized German self-sufficiency and independence from foreign powers in all strategic resources. Fuel sat at the top of that list, and Hitler made synthetic production a national priority almost immediately. What nobody fully appreciated was how long that construction would actually take. By 1937, hydrogenation plants scattered across central Germany were producing approximately 4.8 million barrels of synthetic petroleum products annually. It was a start, but it was nowhere near enough. Göring's revised targets called for nearly 88 million barrels of various fuels and lubricants by 1942, a figure that would have represented complete or near complete independence from imported oil. Achieving that goal required building new plants at a pace that German industry simply couldn't sustain. Steel was the first bottleneck. Synthetic fuel facilities required enormous quantities of structural steel, specialized alloys, pressure vessels, and piping systems that consume resources also needed for tank production, aircraft manufacturing, naval construction, and countless other military priorities. Every ton of steel allocated to a hydrogenation plant was a ton that couldn't build a panzer or a submarine. Manpower created similar conflicts, as skilled workers were needed everywhere at once, and there weren't enough to go around. When the war actually began in September 1939, the synthetic fuel program was far behind schedule. Only 7 plants were fully operational. 3 more were in advanced stages of construction. 2 had barely broken ground. The ambitious targets for 1942 would clearly not be met, and Germany was going to war with fuel production capacity that fell dramatically short of what planners had originally intended. Despite these shortfalls, output did grow substantially over the following years. Synthetic fuel production climbed from 10 million barrels in 1938 to 36 million barrels by 1943, representing a more than 3-fold increase. The proportion of synthetic fuels in Germany's overall supply rose from 22% to over 50% during the same period. By 1943, more than half of all German fuel came from coal, not petroleum, and that included the fuel powering the Luftwaffe. German aircraft by mid-war were flying primarily on coal-derived aviation gasoline, a fact that seems almost surreal given the performance demands of modern combat aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf FW 190, the bombers and transport aircraft that the Luftwaffe deployed across every front, all of them increasingly depended on synthetic fuel extracted from coal through the hydrogenation process. The technology worked and the planes flew, but there was a critical difference that affected performance in ways that mattered during combat. Quality was the issue, and it couldn't be easily solved. German synthetic aviation gasoline typically achieved an octane rating of around 87 range, while Allied aircraft were running on 100-octane fuel produced from high-quality petroleum. Octane rating directly affects how much compression an engine can handle before the fuel detonates prematurely, a phenomenon called knocking that damages engines and reduces power output. Higher octane fuel allows for higher compression ratios, which translates directly into more horsepower and better performance at altitude. German pilots flying against American and British opponents were, in effect, fighting with engines that couldn't reach their full potential. The power advantage that superior octane provided wasn't enormous in any single engagement, but it accumulated across thousands of dogfights and bomber intercept missions. At critical moments when maximum performance mattered most, German aircraft were operating at a disadvantage that no amount of pilot skill could entirely overcome. The shortage of high-quality fuel also limited pilot training, as there simply wasn't enough aviation gasoline to keep new pilots flying sufficient hours before sending them into combat. By late war, German pilots were entering combat with drastically fewer training hours than their Allied counterparts, a disparity that showed in casualty figures. What happened next pushed German engineers toward even more radical solutions. With liquid fuel supplies increasingly unreliable, German researchers explored alternatives that went beyond synthetic gasoline entirely. One approach involved developing engines that could burn pulverized coal directly, eliminating the need for chemical conversion altogether. The concept was straightforward in theory. Grind coal into powder fine enough to behave almost like a liquid, inject it into a combustion chamber, and ignite it to produce power. In practice, the engineering challenges proved immense. Coal ash fouled engines rapidly, abrasive particles wore down components, and the power output couldn't match conventional engines. Some experimental work continued throughout the war, but direct coal combustion never reached practical military application. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because what comes next explains how the Allies finally broke Germany's coal-to-fuel lifeline. German synthetic fuel production reached its peak in 1943. It was a genuine industrial achievement, representing years of investment and engineering expertise that other nations couldn't easily replicate. Yet even at peak capacity, Germany's fuel production remained a tiny fraction of what the Allies could generate from conventional petroleum sources. The United States alone was producing approximately 4 million barrels of oil per day by 1943, a daily output that exceeded Germany's entire annual synthetic production by a factor of 40. The disparity in quantity was matched by disparity in quality and security. American oil wells sat thousands of miles from any possible enemy attack, protected by 2 oceans and an intact industrial base. German synthetic fuel plants were concentrated in a relatively small geographic area, dependent on complex industrial processes that required months to repair if damaged, and increasingly visible to Allied reconnaissance aircraft. In May of 1944, Allied strategic bombers began systematically targeting German synthetic fuel production. The campaign was devastating from the very first raids. On May 12th, more than 900 bombers struck facilities across Germany, leaving approximately half of the targeted plants damaged or destroyed in a single day. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, later admitted that the technological war was effectively decided on that date. The infrastructure that Germany had spent years building was being dismantled from the air faster than it could possibly be repaired. Between May and September of 1944, Allied bombing reduced German synthetic fuel production by approximately 85%. The numbers tell a story of total collapse, down from the peaks that had seemed so promising just months earlier. The carefully constructed coal-to-fuel industry was being systematically obliterated, and every attempt at repair attracted fresh bombing raids that undid whatever progress had been made. August of 1944 delivered another catastrophic blow when Romania fell to advancing Soviet forces, cutting Germany off from the Ploiești oil fields that had supplied a substantial portion of imported petroleum. The dual disaster of bombing destruction and loss of Romanian oil created a situation from which there was no recovery. Germany, in 1944, achieved peak industrial production in many categories, with factories turning out tanks and aircraft in greater numbers than ever before. But those factories couldn't operate at full capacity because there wasn't enough fuel to power them. Vehicles rolled off assembly lines and sat waiting for gasoline that never arrived. Negative feedback loops accelerated the collapse. Without fuel, factories couldn't run efficiently. Without efficient factory operation, fewer replacement parts and maintenance supplies reached the front. Without proper maintenance, vehicles broke down at higher rates. Without fuel to power recovery vehicles, broken down tanks couldn't be retrieved and repaired. Each problem made every other problem worse, creating a spiral that no amount of engineering ingenuity could reverse. Aircraft that had been flying on coal-derived fuel now sat grounded on airfields because there was no fuel at all. Tanks sat in defensive positions with empty fuel tanks while enemy forces closed in. The coal-to-fuel technology that had kept Germany fighting was being strangled out of existence. The final weeks of the war produced images that would have seemed unthinkable just years earlier. German army trucks that once carried supplies across continents were reduced to being towed by oxen through the rubble of collapsing Germany. The nation that had pioneered synthetic fuel production, that had proven coal could become gasoline through sheer chemical ingenuity, was watching its military regress to transportation methods from before the Industrial Revolution. During the Battle of Berlin in April 1945, many of the remaining armored vehicles stationed around the capital couldn't be deployed to defend the city. Tanks sat in fortified positions with empty fuel tanks, while Soviet forces closed in from every direction. The resources existed on paper, the crews were ready to fight, but without fuel, the most powerful weapons were reduced to expensive bunkers. Hitler continued issuing orders from his bunker for divisions to counterattack and reinforcements to move, apparently unable or unwilling to accept that his commands couldn't be followed because the vehicles had no fuel to execute them. Operation Spring. Awakening in early 1945 represented Germany's final major offensive, a desperate attempt to secure oil fields in Hungary that might provide some relief from the crushing fuel shortage. The operation failed, and within weeks, the surviving soldiers were prisoners. The coal-based fuel economy that had sustained German military operations for years had finally, completely collapsed. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender, the legacy of synthetic fuel production became a subject of study for nations around the world. Germany had proven definitively that coal could be converted into liquid fuel on an industrial scale. The technology worked, the chemistry was sound. Given different circumstances, perhaps an earlier start or protection from bombing or larger initial investment, the outcome might have been different. South Africa would later adopt Fischer-Tropsch technology during the apartheid era, when international sanctions cut off petroleum imports and the nation's abundant coal reserves provided an alternative path to fuel independence. The Sasol facilities that emerged proved the long-term viability of the approach, though they required massive capital investment and years to construct. The fundamental lesson of Germany's synthetic fuel program was both technical and strategic. Chemistry could accomplish remarkable things, but chemistry couldn't overcome basic mathematics. Germany started the war with fuel production capacity inadequate for the conflict it intended to fight, and no amount of innovative engineering could close the gap against enemies who controlled vastly greater resources. The United States produced as much oil in about 10 days as Germany's synthetic industry could make in an entire year. Coal kept Germany fighting longer than conventional petroleum supplies alone would have allowed. The synthetic fuel industry represented genuine technological achievement and extraordinary industrial effort. But against adversaries wielding the combined industrial might of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire, the war was always going to end the same way. Stalin summarized it with brutal clarity after the war. The outcome, he said, was determined by engines and octane. Germany had the engines. What it never had was enough octane to keep them running. I hope may this changed how you understand World War II, and there are plenty more untold stories like this one waiting to be explored.